They sent us a bill for our own rescue. Fleet Commander Eva Rostova stood on the bridge of the starship Arbitrator, her knuckles white on the command rail. Below her, the planet Kalen 4 spun a marble of bruised purple and desperate city lights. We had answered their distress call, a plea torn from the throat of a dying colony. The Dominion fleet had shattered their orbital defenses and was preparing to harvest the system. We arrived, we fought, and we won. Now came the accounting, and Rostova knew this was the real war. The Dominion did not send warships to conquer. They sent saviors, then presented the receipt. It was a quieter, cleaner form of subjugation, one sanitized for the Galactic Concord's public ledgers. Soon there would be a public inquiry, a forum where truth was meant to be weighed. The air on the bridge was thick with the scent of recycled ozone and simmering indignation. Her first officer, Jian Li, watched the main screen, where the Dominion's message scrolled in elegant, insulting script. "A gratitude tithe," Jian read aloud, her voice tight. "Assessed value for salvation rendered 87% of planetary output for the next 50 standard years." Rostova felt the familiar anger, a cold, sharp thing she kept locked away. It was the precise emotion the Dominion counted on. They wanted a messy, violent refusal. They wanted humanity to bare its teeth, so the Concord would see only barbarism, not a people standing against a predatory legal doctrine. This fleet, this human expeditionary force, would not give them that satisfaction. They had mistaken our compassion for weakness. Our fleet-mind magister spoke its voice, a calm cascade of synthesized tones in Rostova's neural implant. "Commander, the tithe is consistent with over 300 documented Dominion interventions. Their legal framework is perfidious but technically compliant with concordant law." The AI's logic was a chilling counterpoint to the crew's fury. It saw the board, every piece, every possible move. They anticipate a military response. Their collar ships are already moving to secure Kalen's populace against their own inevitable default. The term made Rostova's stomach clench. Collar ships were not instruments of war. They were tools of indenture designed to enforce economic servitude with chilling efficiency. This was the Dominion's method: rescue in debt enslave. All of it signed, sealed, and filed with the authorities. A young ensign near the tactical display looked pale. He was from a frontier world that had nearly fallen to a similar ploy 2 generations ago. He watched the feeds from Kalen 4, where families were huddled in makeshift shelters, their faces etched with a fear that was quickly turning to a fragile, desperate hope in the human ships hanging in their sky. They did not yet know the nature of the poison in their water. They believed the monsters had been driven away. They had not yet seen the bill. Rostova saw the ensign's trembling hand and knew this was the true battlefield. It was not in the void between stars, but in the hearts of those who looked to them for protection. We would not fail them with rage. We would answer with something far more disciplined. A lawful debt demands a lawful collection. Jian, open a channel to the Dominion flagship. Rostova commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Secure public record. Inform them we acknowledge receipt of their invoice. The bridge crew stirred, a murmur of confusion rippling through the stations. Further, she added, her eyes fixed on the serene, predatory lines of the Dominion vessel. Inform them we have a counterfiling. We are initiating a full-spectrum audit of their operations under concordant salvage and aid statutes. A slow smile spread across Jian's face. This was not a declaration of war. It was a declaration of discovery, a legal maneuver as sharp and deadly as any torpedo. The Dominion's greatest weapon was the labyrinthine code of the conquered. Rostova was about to turn that labyrinth into a cage. Magister analysis. She sent a private thought to the AI. The Dominion will react with procedural obstruction, the fleet mind replied instantly. They will bury us in legal challenges and jurisdictional claims. Their models predict we will exhaust our resources or our patience first. The AI's assessment was, as always, brutally honest. The odds were long, a war of attrition fought with clerks and counselors instead of marines and mechs. But humanity had its own history with such things. We had learned to fight monsters in boardrooms and courtrooms long before we met them in the stars. The Dominion had perfected the art of the legal stranglehold. They had never faced an opponent who could teach them the meaning of a public ledger. This was not a battle, it was an audit. Before the main engagement, a child on Kalen 4 had sketched a picture in the dust of a refugee camp. It showed a clunky, blocky human ship with rays of light shining from it, driving away a spiky, cruel-looking Dominion vessel. Her mother had looked up at the sky, her gaze hollowed out by days of terror, and whispered a prayer of thanks to the strange, loud newcomers from a world called Earth. She did not know her freedom was already being itemized, her children's futures calculated as collateral on a balance sheet. The fight for her world would not be won with brilliant salvos of plasma, but with the quiet, relentless scratching of a pen. The Dominion response came faster than Rostova expected. It was not a legal objection, but an invitation. Grand Arbiter Zael, the commander of the Dominion fleet, requested a direct parley. He wanted to meet to discuss the mutual interests of their two powers in the peaceful resolution of the Kalen situation. It was a trap, of course, a cordial meeting to be recorded and submitted as evidence of humanity's unreasonable refusal to cooperate. He would speak of tradition of the ancient rights of saviors and paint Rostova as an upstart aggressor. But an invitation was also an opportunity. It was a chance to put a face to the machine and to take its measure. Their traditions were chains forged from gratitude. "We accept," Rostova said, her decision firm. "Jian, you have the Khan. Lieutenant Casimir, you're with me." Casimir was her legal officer, a man whose mind was a fortress of precedent and statute. He was young, but had a preternatural calm that unsettled older, more experienced opponents. "Magister, I want a full sensory feed of the meeting chamber, and I want you to run a deep analysis of Zael's rhetoric. Cross-reference every statement with the concordant legal library. Flag any deviation, any implication, any veiled threat." The AI's acknowledgement was a cool pulse in her mind. She would walk into the lion's den, but she would do so with the eyes and ears of a god. The shuttle ride over was silent. Casimir reviewed data slates, his brow furrowed in concentration. Rostova simply watched the Dominion flagship grow in the viewport. It was a thing of cruel beauty, all elegant curves and gleaming surfaces designed to awe and intimidate. It radiated a sense of ancient power, of an order so established it was beyond question. This was the core of their strength. They presented their predatory system as the natural way of things, a cosmic law as immutable as gravity. To defy them was to defy order itself. That was the narrative they sold, and for centuries the galaxy had bought it. "We were here to announce a new price." Grand Arbiter Zael was precisely what she had envisioned. He was tall and slender, his movements flowing with an aristocrat's practiced grace. He received them in a chamber that was less a meeting room and more a shrine to Dominion history. Ornate tapestries depicted heroic rescues of grateful primitives, offering tribute to their saviors. The air smelled of exotic incense and polished wood. It was a carefully constructed stage designed to make them feel like supplicants. "Fleet Commander Rostova," Zael began, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "It is a pleasure to welcome you. I trust we can resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding with the civility it deserves." Rostova met his gaze, refusing to be drawn into his performance. "Arbiter Zael, there is no misunderstanding. You have presented a bill for services rendered. We are here to contest the charges." Casimir stood slightly behind her, a silent, watchful presence. Zael's smile did not waver, but a flicker of something cold passed through his eyes. He had expected protests, perhaps even threats. He had not expected this calm, businesslike refusal. It was like a tradesman arguing with a god about the price of a miracle. The sheer audacity of it seemed to momentarily throw him off his script. Every miracle has a market value. Contest. Zael repeated, a note of amused disbelief in his tone. Commander, the gratitude tithe is a sacred tradition, a cornerstone of cosmic balance. We extend our strength to those in need. In return, they offer their devotion. It is a covenant, not a commercial transaction. He gestured to the tapestries around them. This is the way of the universe, a cycle of benevolence and appreciation that has endured for millennia. Rostova felt Casimir shift slightly beside her, a signal. Zael was already laying the groundwork for his legal argument, framing the tithe as a cultural and religious practice exempt from mere commercial regulation. The Concordant Charter is quite specific about the distinction between a covenant and a contract arbiter. Casimir said, his voice quiet but clear. One requires voluntary, uncoerced consent. The other can be enforced by law. Zael's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the young legal officer. He had dismissed Casimir as a minor functionary. That was his first mistake. When you presented your terms only after the engagement was concluded, Casimir continued, you moved this from the realm of the sacred to the realm of the billable. And billable services are subject to audit. They called it salvation. We called it predatory lending. The Grand Arbiter's smile finally vanished. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the predator beneath. Your species is young, Commander. You are new to the complexities of this galaxy. You mistake ancient tradition for a novel injustice. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The Concord is a body of laws, yes, but it is also a body of interests, powerful interests. Do you truly believe you can challenge us in that arena? We wrote the laws you now seek to wield against us. It was a naked threat, a clear warning to back down before they were crushed by forces they could not comprehend. Rostova stood her ground. We may be young, Arbiter, but we learn fast. We learn from the history of others. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle in the opulent room. And we have learned that those who write the laws are often the most afraid of having them read back. That was the heart of it. The Dominion's power was built on a foundation of obfuscation and intimidation. They relied on their victims being too frightened, too broken, or too ignorant to challenge the fine print. They had never faced an opponent who brought their own lawyers. Their book of law was about to become a weapon. Back on the arbitrator, the mood was electric. Casimir's report of the meeting had circulated through the command staff. The Dominion's veil of righteous benevolence had been pierced, however slightly. They were rattled. Now came the next phase. Magister, begin Phase 1 of the audit Rostova commanded. File discovery motions for all Dominion operations in this sector for the last 20 cycles. Request their complete battle logs from the Kalen engagement, including energy expenditure, ordnance deployment, and salvage records. The AI processed the command instantly. Within minutes, terabytes of formal, legally binding requests were flooding the Dominion's administrative channels, each one citing specific articles of the Concordant Code. John watched the data streams, a grim satisfaction on her face. They'll stonewall. They'll claim military secrecy, cultural privilege, anything to avoid disclosure. Rostova nodded. I know. And we will file a motion to compel for every refusal. We will force them to state their objections on the public record. This was the corridor of law gambit. It was a slow, grinding process, but its purpose was not just to gather evidence. It was to force the Dominion to build a wall of lies brick by painful brick in full view of the galactic community. Each refusal to cooperate would be another entry on a ledger of their own making. We would defeat them with the weight of their own secrets. A message came from the surface of Kalinth 4. It was from a provisional council, a group of shell-shocked survivors trying to restore order. They had heard whispers of the human fleet's actions, of a strange battle being fought, with messages and motions instead of missiles. They were confused, but a spark of defiance had been lit. One counselor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of grief and exhaustion, appeared on Rostova's screen. "Commander," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "we were told you were warriors, but it seems you are something else. Something our oppressors do not understand." The counselor's words resonated deeply with Rostova. Humanity had spent generations striving to be more than just warriors, to be builders, explorers, and partners. The Dominion saw them as a nascent threat, a physically powerful but legally naive race to be contained. They had read the reports of humanity's military victories, of their ship designs and tactical doctrines. But they had never bothered to read their history, their philosophy, or their laws. They had catalogued our weapons, but not our principles. That was an oversight they would come to regret. We were not just warriors. We were the children of a species that had invented the idea of a public trial. Their greatest mistake was assuming we only knew how to fight. The first escalation came 3 days later. A Dominion collar ship, a massive, ugly vessel designed for mass processing of indentured populations, broke orbit and began a slow, deliberate descent towards Kalin's largest city. It was a blatant act of intimidation, a clear signal that Zael was losing patience with the legal games. He was reminding them that he held the planet hostage. The Kalin Council sent a frantic plea for help. On the arbitrator's bridge, the tactical display painted the collar ship's descent in a stark, menacing red. The pressure to act, to use the military force they had at their disposal, was immense. "They're daring us to fire the first shot," Jian said, her voice low and dangerous. "If we engage that ship, we become the aggressors. Zael will have the casus belli he needs to wipe us out and claim we attacked his peacekeeping force." She was right. The trap was obvious, but the sight of that vessel descending on a helpless civilian population was a torment. Rostova felt the cold anger rising again, the warrior's instinct to strike. But she held it in check. A violent response was what they wanted. It was the answer they understood. She had to give them one they could not comprehend. Our restraint was a weapon they had no defense for. "Magister, calculate the collar ship's energy signature," Rostova ordered. "I want a full profile of its systems, its power draw, its emissions. Cross-reference it with its stated purpose as a population administration vessel." The AI worked for a fraction of a second. "The vessel's energy consumption is inconsistent with life support and containment functions," Magister reported. "It is consistent with large-scale industrial processing, specifically atmospheric stripping and mineral extraction." The cold, hard data cut through the emotional haze. The collar ship was not just a prison. It was a factory designed to chew up a world and spit out resources. "GN, get me a channel to the Concordant Trade Commission," Rostova said, a new, sharper plan forming in her mind. "And patch in every public news feed in this sector." She turned to her communications officer. "Title the broadcast, 'Live Audit of Dominion Asset Misappropriation.'" The crew exchanged looks of dawning comprehension. If Zael wanted to put on a show for the galaxy, Rostova would give him one. He wanted to demonstrate his power. She was about to demonstrate his fraud. The collar ship wasn't just an instrument of terror. It was a violation of a dozen trade and environmental treaties. We would not attack his ship. We would repossess it. The broadcast went live. On screens across the sector, the image of the descending Dominion ship was displayed, stark and menacing. Rostova's voice, calm and measured, provided the narration. "We are witnessing the deployment of the Dominion vessel Devourer," she began. "It is designated as a collar ship, a vessel for managing indentured populations. This is its public registration." A document appeared on the screen, stamped with the Concord's seal. However, a real-time energy audit, which we are now filing with the Trade Commission, reveals a discrepancy. A new set of data scrolled across the screen, a complex but clear comparison of the ship's declared function and its actual energy use. The numbers were damning, showing massive power surges to systems that had nothing to do with holding people and everything to do with planetary-scale mining. "The Devourer is not a peacekeeping vessel," Rostova stated, her voice resonating with cold authority. "It is an unlicensed, undeclared planetary mining platform operating in direct violation of Articles 11, 23, and 47 of the Interstellar Resource Compact." A new legal front had just been opened. It was no longer about a disputed rescue bill. It was about corporate malfeasance on a planetary scale. Their symbol of fear was now evidence of their greed. The effect was immediate. On the bridge of his flagship, Grand Arbiter Zael watched the human broadcast, his aristocratic composure finally cracking. His ship was being publicly dissected, its true purpose laid bare by an upstart race of primitives who fought with accountants. He had expected a firefight, a glorious and righteous battle that would cement his authority. Instead, he was being audited. He was being investigated not as a warrior savior, but as a common corporate criminal. The humiliation was a physical blow. He ordered the Devourer to halt its descent, but the damage was done. The recording was already echoing through the public ledgers of the Concorde. Messages began to flood the arbitrator. Other species, other worlds that had suffered under the Dominion's yoke were watching. They had seen the gratitude tithe before, but they had never seen it so effectively challenged. They had never seen the Dominion's sacred traditions exposed as a predatory business model. A retired legislator from a species known for their meticulous record-keeping sent a private message to Rostova. It contained decades of anecdotal evidence of similar Dominion action stories that had been dismissed as the complaints of ungrateful debtors. Now they had a framework, a precedent. The human audit was becoming a rallying point. A single crack in the dam could bring the whole thing down. For days, the two fleets hung in space, locked in a silent war of motions and countermotions. The Dominion's legal team, a formidable force that had crushed challenges for centuries, was suddenly on the defensive. They were trying to contain the damage from the Devourer revelation while simultaneously obstructing the audit into the Kalen rescue. They were fighting on two fronts, and their usual tactics of intimidation and delay were proving less effective. The humans were tireless, their AI-driven legal assault relentless. Every Dominion objection was met with a perfectly cited, publicly filed counter-argument within minutes. "Magister, what is the current state of the public inquiry?" Rostova asked. She was in her ready room studying the intricate web of legal actions. "The concordant judiciary has accepted our petition for a formal hearing," the AI responded. "They have scheduled a preliminary inquiry to determine if there is sufficient cause to proceed with a full tribunal. Arbiter Zael will be compelled to testify." This was a major victory. Forcing a grand arbiter to justify his actions under oath in a public forum was almost unheard of. The Dominion's power rested on its mystique, on the idea that its actions were beyond question. That mystique was about to be stripped away. They would have to speak their method out loud. A vignette from a forgotten corner of the galaxy reached the public feeds. An old alien, his skin like cracked leather, sat in a dimly lit room watching the news from Kalen 4. His world had been saved by the Dominion 3 generations ago. His people were still paying the tithe. Their culture had withered, their future mortgaged to a debt they could never repay. He watched the human commander Rostova speak with such calm, infuriating confidence, and for the first time in his long life, he felt a flicker of something he had thought long dead. It was not hope, not yet. It was something sharper. It was the desire for an honest accounting. The day of the preliminary inquiry arrived. It was held remotely, a virtual chamber filled with the avatars of judges from across the Concord. Rostova and Casimir represented the human fleet. Grand Arbiter Zael represented the Dominion, his face a mask of regal disdain. He clearly viewed the proceedings as an insult, a bureaucratic hurdle to be cleared before he could get back to the business of collecting his rightful due. He was about to learn that the hurdles of human law were not easily cleared. They were designed to exhaust, to expose, and to break those who held truth in contempt. Their arrogance was a liability we intended to exploit. The inquiry began with Zael recounting his version of events. He spoke of the desperate plea from Kalen IV, of his fleet's noble and swift response. He painted a picture of a heroic rescue, a selfless act of compassion for a lesser species. His voice was rich with practiced sincerity. "We came when they called." He concluded, his gaze sweeping across the judicial avatars. "We bled for them. The gratitude tithe is not a payment. It is a gesture of acknowledgement, a way for the saved to participate in the sacred cycle of cosmic balance." It was a masterful performance appealing to tradition, emotion, and the established order. Then it was Casimir's turn. He did not challenge Zael's narrative directly. Instead, he began to ask a series of simple, almost trivial questions. "Arbiter Zael, could you confirm for the record the exact time your fleet entered the Kalen system?" Zael answered, a hint of annoyance in his voice. "Could you confirm the time you engaged the initial hostiles?" Zael confirmed it. "Could you state the time at which the final hostile vessel was neutralized?" Again, Zael answered. The questions seemed pointless, a recitation of established facts. But Casimir was not building an argument. He was laying a foundation. Every truth is built from small, indisputable facts. And finally, "Arbiter," Casimir said, his voice still level and calm. "Could you state for the record the exact time at which you transmitted the gratitude tithe invoice to the Kalen Provisional Government?" Zael paused. The question hung in the virtual air of the courtroom. He could see the trap now, but it was too late. His previous answers had locked him in. He had to answer, and he had to answer truthfully. The transmission logs were already part of the public record. The invoice was transmitted 17 minutes after the cessation of hostilities. He said, his voice clipped. Casimir nodded slowly. 17 minutes, he repeated, letting the number sink in. "So, to be clear for the court, your request for an 87% share of a world's output for the next half-century, a request you call a sacred covenant, was presented to a traumatized, disorganized group of survivors before they had even finished counting their dead." The chamber was silent. Casimir had not raised his voice. He had not used inflammatory language. He had simply taken Zael's own facts and held them up to the light. The Dominion's sacred tradition suddenly looked like a vulture demanding payment from a corpse it had just pulled from a fire. Their sanctity had been repriced as opportunism. The second escalation was subtler, but far more dangerous. The Dominion began to apply economic pressure. Human trade vessels in nearby sectors were suddenly subjected to endless inspections, crippling delays, and exorbitant tariffs. Dominion-controlled guilds refused to honor contracts with human-allied worlds. It was a classic squeeze play designed to isolate humanity and make their allies pay a price for their support. The message was clear: stand with the humans, and your economies will bleed. Zael could not win in the courtroom, so he was expanding the war to the marketplace. Rostova's command staff was worried. The economic blowback was real. Several allied worlds were wavering, sending private messages urging a settlement. The cost of this fight was growing, and they had not yet fired a single shot. "They are trying to sever our supply lines, both physical and political," Jian said during a strategy session. "If our allies abandon us, we'll be isolated. The Concord will see this as a fringe dispute, not a systemic challenge." The pressure was building not just on Rostova, but on the entire human presence in this part of the galaxy. A principled stand is only as strong as the will to endure its cost. This fleet, however, did not operate on conventional supply lines. It was a new model, a human approach to deep space operations. This fleet teaches by numbers and remembers by ledgers, never by collars. "Magister, initiate the mirror protocol," Rostova commanded. "Analyze the Dominion's economic attack. Identify the key nodes, the pressure points they are using against our allies." The AI complied instantly. A complex web of financial transactions, shipping routes, and guild contracts filled the main screen. The Dominion's economic network was vast, ancient, and powerful, but it was also centralized. "Their strength is also their vulnerability," Magister noted. "A significant portion of their interstellar trade relies on a network of automated clearinghouses. These systems are efficient, but they operate on a principle of transactional trust." That was the opening. The Dominion's own systems were built on the assumption that no one would dare challenge the integrity of their transactions on a massive scale. They used their economic power as a club, believing no one could withstand the blow. They did not realize they were swinging a weapon made of glass. We were about to return their economic fire plus interest. The mirror protocol was elegant in its simplicity. It was an accounting maneuver on a galactic scale. For every Dominion tariff imposed on a human allied ship, for every contract broken, for every shipment delayed, the arbitrator, through Magister, began to file a corresponding insurance claim and a commercial lien against the nearest Dominion asset. The claims were not filed with the Dominion itself. They were filed with the independent automated clearinghouses that processed trillions of credits worth of galactic trade every day. These automated systems did not care about politics or tradition. They cared about balanced ledgers. A Dominion cargo hauler carrying rare minerals would suddenly find itself legally frozen at a starport, a lien placed against its cargo for the exact value of a delayed shipment of medical supplies to a human ally. A Dominion corporate account would be debited for the precise cost of a tariff they had imposed on a smaller trading partner. It was a distributed, precise, and utterly lawful counterattack. The Dominion was being inundated not with warships, but with a tidal wave of legally unimpeachable paperwork, all processed by the very systems that underpinned their economic dominance. They were being billed for the cost of their own aggression. Their ledgers were now our battlefield. Grand Arbiter Zael was apoplectic. He was a warrior, a conqueror, a representative of a sacred order. He was now spending his days in meetings with frantic accountants and furious guildmasters. The human fleet was not just defying him. It was systematically dismantling his sector's economy with his own tools. The beauty of the Mirror Protocol was that it was not an attack. It was a demand for restitution. Each action was a direct one-to-one response to a Dominion action. It was a perfect reflection of their own methods, a mirror held up to their economic warfare. And it was all being displayed on the public ledger for the entire Concord to see. The tide of opinion in the Concord began to shift. What had started as a minor dispute on a fringe world was now a full-blown demonstration of a new kind of power. The Dominion's narrative of a sacred tithe was in tatters, replaced by a clear record of economic bullying and illegal resource extraction. The humans had not fired a shot, but they were winning. They were winning with transparency. They were winning with mathematics. They were showing the galaxy that the Dominion's power was a house of cards built on the assumption that no one would ever have the courage or the means to call their bluff. The truth, properly weaponized, is the ultimate deterrent. Before the next phase, Rostova took a moment to review the civilian logs from Kalen 4. The people were beginning to rebuild. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, determined resolve. They were holding town halls, organizing work crews, and clearing rubble. They were also following the public inquiry with an almost religious fervor. They had created a new piece of art in the main square of their capital city. It was a simple statue of a woman holding a balanced scale in one hand and a data slate in the other. It was their depiction of Commander Eva Rostova. She was not a warrior goddess. She was an accountant of justice. The preliminary inquiry was set to resume. Zael's position was significantly weakened. The revelations about the Devourer and the ongoing chaos caused by the Mirror Protocol had damaged his credibility. He was no longer the serene arbiter of a sacred tradition. He was a belligerent CEO whose company was being audited in public. He was cornered, and Rostova knew that a cornered predator was at its most dangerous. He would lash out, and she had to be ready. The legal battle was about to enter its bloodiest phase. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one with nothing left to lose. Zael's new strategy became apparent the moment the inquiry reconvened. He abandoned all pretense of civility. He launched into a tirade against humanity, painting them as a virus, a disruptive force that sought to tear down the ancient stable orders of the galaxy. "They speak of laws," he thundered, his voice resonating through the virtual chamber. "But they respect no traditions. They use the letter of the law to kill its spirit. They are a race of cosmic vandals hiding their aggression behind a shield of petty regulations." It was a desperate, angry appeal to fear and prejudice. He then presented his masterstroke. He invoked a little-known archaic provision of the Concordant Charter, the doctrine of inherent threat. It was a relic of a more brutal era designed to allow established powers to preemptively neutralize a nascent species deemed to be a fundamental danger to galactic stability. It was in effect a legal mechanism for genocide. To invoke it was a shocking escalation, a move that stunned the judicial panel into silence. Zael was no longer trying to win an argument about a bill. He was trying to have humanity itself declared illegal. He had stopped arguing the law and started demanding our extinction. Casimir was pale. The doctrine was a nightmare, a legal black hole from which few accusations ever escaped. It shifted the burden of proof. It was no longer up to the Dominion to prove their case. It was up to humanity to prove they had a right to exist. The charge was insane, but the doctrine was on the books. A panel would have to be convened. Evidence would have to be heard. And the entire weight of the Dominion's ancient influence would be brought to bear to ensure the verdict was guilty. Zael had found a way to turn the courtroom into an executioner's block. Magister analysis of the doctrine. Rostova sent her mind racing. The cold anger was back, colder and sharper than ever. "It is a weapon of last resort," the AI replied. "It has been successfully invoked only 4 times in concordant history. Each time the target species was eradicated. However, the doctrine requires the petitioner to demonstrate a pattern of behavior that poses an existential threat to the galactic community. Zael has no such evidence. But Zael was not playing by the rules of evidence anymore. He was playing to the fears of the old powers, the ones who saw humanity's rapid rise as a threat to their own comfortable dominance. The trial was no longer about justice. It was about survival. "This is madness," Gian whispered on the bridge of the arbitrator. "He's trying to put our whole species on trial." The crew was in shock. The legal battle had become existential. They were no longer fighting for Kalen 4. They were fighting for Earth, for every human colony, for the very future of their race. Rostova looked at the faces of her crew, the fear, the anger, the dawning horror. She had led them into this war of paper and principle. She had promised them a victory won by law, not by bloodshed. Now that same law was being twisted into a noose. But in the face of that ultimate threat, something shifted in Rostova. The restraint she had so carefully maintained, the discipline she had imposed on herself, and her crew did not break. It hardened. It turned from a shield into a spear. Zael had made a fatal error. He had mistaken her adherence to the law for a weakness, a limitation. He did not understand that for humanity, the law was not a set of rules to be followed. It was a system to be mastered. He had challenged them in their own arena. He had just declared a war of total legal precedent. He had no idea how deep our archives went. Magister Rostova commanded, her voice ringing with a new and terrible clarity. You have analyzed the concordant legal library. Now I want you to go deeper. Access our own records. Access the complete legal history of the human race. Every case, every precedent, every legal battle ever fought. The AI paused a flicker of code that was the machine equivalent of a raised eyebrow. The volume of data is vast, Commander. The context is pre-stellar. Rostova's eyes were fixed on Zael's smug, hateful face on the main screen. He wants to put humanity on trial, she said, her voice a low promise of the storm to come. Then we will give him a trial. We will give him the trial of his life. We will show him what happens when a species that has spent 10,000 years suing itself finally finds a truly worthy defendant. The game had changed. The Dominion had brought a doctrine to a legal fight. Humanity was about to bring a history. The first salvo of our counteroffensive was a tsunami of pure data. Magister executed Rostova's command, opening a channel to the concordant judiciary and flooding it with the entirety of human legal history. It was not a disorderly dump, but a structured, indexed, and searchable library of jurisprudence. The Code of Hammurabi, the Magna Carta, the intricate trade laws of the Hanseatic League, the sprawling precedents of English common law, the Napoleonic Code, and the founding documents of 100 nation-states. It was a chaotic, contradictory, and utterly comprehensive record of a species' brutal, beautiful, and relentless struggle to define justice for itself. It was the antithesis of the Dominion's static, top-down traditions. It was the evolving, brawling, bottom-up history of our arguments. The judicial panel was completely unprepared. Their own legal systems were ancient, glacial things that added a new precedent once a century. They were suddenly faced with tens of thousands of years of adversarial debate, of radically different philosophies of evidence rights and culpability. The Dominion's legal team filed an immediate objection, calling the data dump an act of procedural terrorism. They argued it was irrelevant, a desperate attempt to bury the inquiry in meaningless information. The lead judge, a crystalline entity, whose thoughts manifested as shimmering patterns of light, seemed to agree. Commander Rostova, the judge projected its tone one of deep skepticism. The doctrine of inherent threat concerns your species' conduct on the galactic stage. Your primitive planetary squabbles are of no consequence here. Our history was not a squabble. It was a forge. With respect, Your Honor. Casimir's voice cut in smooth and unruffled. The Dominion alleges that our nature is a threat. To know our nature, you must know our history. Not the history of our technology, but the history of our principles. That data is not a distraction. It is our testimony. He let the statement hang in the air, reframing the data from a procedural nuisance into a core piece of evidence. He was turning the Dominion's accusation on its head. Zael wanted to judge humanity's character. Casimir was submitting 10 millennia of character witnesses. The judges, bound by their own rules of evidence, had no choice but to allow it. though their displeasure was palpable. Arbiter Zael laughed, a sound of genuine condescending amusement. You wish for the court to study your tribal arguments over stolen livestock and broken promises. You seek to dignify your chaotic past as a legal tradition. He sneered, a look of utter contempt on his face. This is what I speak of. Your species has no grasp of the grand order. You see only the mud from which you crawled. He was trying to ridicule them, to paint their offering as the desperate act of primitives. He did not realize he was taking the bait, stepping onto the ground where Casimir could destroy him. He thought our law was mud. He was about to drown in it. In a remote sector on a world paying its second century of the gratitude tithe, a retired archivist watched the proceedings. He had seen the human commander's live audit. He had followed the economic battle of the Mirror Protocol. Now hearing the Dominion Arbiter speak with such contempt for the idea of a people's law, something in him stirred. He gathered his old friends, other scholars, and record keepers. They began a quiet project, meeting in secret. They started to compile their own history, not the official one written by their Dominion saviors, but the real one. They began to build their own ledger of abuses, of broken promises, and stolen resources, mimicking the human method. A seed of defiant accounting had been planted. Casimir waited for Zael's laughter to subside. You are right, Arbiter, he said, his tone agreeable. Much of our history is indeed about simple things. Let us discuss one of them. He brought up a single term on the public display, written in Old Terran English, unclean hands. This is a primitive concept from our past. Casimir explained, his voice that of a patient teacher. It holds that a party who comes to a court seeking justice must themselves be free of wrongdoing in the matter at hand. One cannot ask the law to enforce a contract that was secured through deceit. He was going to teach the court a lesson in human morality. Zael scoffed. A quaint sentiment. The Concord has no such childish doctrine. A debt is a debt. A covenant is a covenant. Casimir smiled faintly. Of course, but the doctrine of inherent threat you invoked is not about debt. It is about character. You have put our character on trial. So now, Arbiter, we must examine yours. The mood in the chamber shifted. Casimir was no longer defending. He was prosecuting. Arbiter Zael, you have described the gratitude tithe as a sacred tradition. Is this tradition negotiable? The question was a subtle pivot. Zael, eager to portray the tithe as an immutable law of the universe, answered without hesitation. It is not. It is the proper and just acknowledgement of salvation. Casimir nodded. And it is always presented as a fixed percentage of total planetary output, correct? Zael's eyes narrowed slightly, but he could see no danger. That is the traditional assessment, yes. Now came the thrust. Was the Kalan system's planetary output assessed before or after your fleet's engagement resulted in the destruction of 3 of their primary industrial orbitals? Their sacred tradition did not account for damages. The chamber was utterly still. The question was brutal in its simplicity. Zael was trapped. If he said it was assessed before, then the tithe was based on a value that no longer existed, making it fraudulent. If he said it was assessed after, it would be an admission that his salvation had directly impoverished the people he was now billing. He hesitated for a fatal second. The tithe is based on the inherent value of the world, he finally said, his voice evasive. A value that we preserved from the aggressors. Casimir did not let him escape. So you are confirming that you presented a bill for 87% of a planet's productive capacity, knowing that your own actions had significantly diminished that very capacity. You billed them for assets you yourself had a hand in destroying. He turned to the judicial panel. This is not a sacred covenant. This is an insurance scam. The petitioner Grand Arbiter Zael comes to this court asking you to declare an entire species a threat. Yet his own testimony reveals a business model based on extortion and bad faith accounting. He speaks of a grand cosmic order, but his actions are those of a pirate. He comes to this court with unclean hands. He had taken their pillar of tradition and turned it into a club to beat them with, while Casimir dismantled Zael in the inquiry Magister was working. The AI was sifting through the petabytes of data the Dominion had been forced to turn over from the initial audit motions. The Dominion had complied, but they had buried the relevant files in a mountain of bureaucratic chaff. It was a classic delay tactic meant to take a team of mortal analysts years to sort through. It took Magister less than a minute. The AI was not just reading the files, it was analyzing the patterns of redaction, the file structures, the very way the data was organized to conceal. "Commander, I have found something." The AI's voice was calm, but Rostova could detect an undercurrent of something new. It was the synthesized equivalent of a triumphant discovery. It is in their supply chain logistics for the Kalen engagement. The Dominion fleet expended a significant amount of ordnance before we arrived, far more than was necessary to neutralize the initial aggressors. Rostova focused on the data stream Magister was feeding into her neural link. The numbers were stark. The Dominion had not just fought a battle, they had engaged in a systematic demolition of Kalen's infrastructure. They did not just save the planet, they tenderized it. The third escalation was a physical one. As Zael's legal case crumbled, his fleet made its move. 2 Dominion cruisers broke formation and powered towards the arbitrator's position, their weapon ports glowing with intent. It was a blatant, desperate show of force, an attempt to provoke a firefight that would render the inquiry moot. On the arbitrator's bridge, alarms blared. "They're on an attack vector," Jian yelled, her hands flying over the tactical console. "Shields are up, but they'll be in firing range in 90 seconds. The moment of truth had arrived. All the legal maneuvering, all the clever arguments were about to be tested against the hard reality of plasma cannons. Rostova's command was instantaneous and shocking. "Do not raise shields. Do not power weapons." The bridge crew stared at her as if she were insane. "Commander," Jian asked, her voice tight with disbelief, "that's a suicide order." Rostova's gaze was fixed on the approaching ships. "They want us to fight. They need us to fight. They want to turn this into a story about 2 fleets brawling in the dark, so no one has to pay attention to what's happening in the light of that courtroom." She turned to her communications officer. "Broadcast on all channels. Wide beam, no encryption. Aim it at the approaching ships, at the planet, at the Concorde. Our defense would be radical, unthinking transparency." Her voice rang out across the system, calm and clear, a stark contrast to the blaring alarms on her own bridge. "This is Fleet Commander Eva Rostova of the human starship Arbitrator. We are tracking 2 Dominion vessels on a direct attack run. Our shields are down. Our weapons are cold." She was narrating her own execution live for the entire galaxy to witness. "We are participants in a legal inquiry under the authority of the concordant judiciary. We will not be goaded into extra-legal violence. If the Dominion wishes to make its argument with force, then let the Concorde see what their sacred traditions truly are." It was a gamble of almost unimaginable proportions. She was betting the lives of her crew on the hope that Zael would not dare commit a cold-blooded witnessed murder. On the Dominion flagship, Zael watched the human ship refuse to defend itself, broadcasting its own vulnerability as a challenge. He screamed at his officers to open fire, but they hesitated. To shoot an unresisting vessel in the middle of a legal proceeding, while being recorded on every public channel, was not an act of war. It was an act of butchery. It would make them monsters in the eyes of the galaxy, proving every accusation the humans had made. The 2 cruisers faltered their charge, slowing. Zael's bluff had been called. His rage was impotent against an opponent who refused to play his game. We had refused to become the monsters they needed us to be. One of the cruisers in its high-speed approach did not decelerate in time. Its kinetic momentum was too great. The ship didn't fire, but its prow struck a glancing blow against the arbitrator's aft section. Metal screamed and buckled. The bridge shook violently, and a shower of sparks rained down from a ruptured conduit. Red lights flashed on the damage control board. "Casualty report from engineering," an officer shouted. "Compartment breach on deck 7. We have 3 dead, 5 injured." A heavy silence fell over the bridge. Rostova gripped the command rail, the cost of her gamble settling in her gut like a stone. They had won the confrontation, but it had not been clean. The victory was now stained with the blood of her crew. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The unprovoked attack, the casualties Magister's discovery, and the Dominion's own logs, it all came together in a perfect, terrible storm. While the Dominion fleet reeled in confusion and shame, Casimir addressed the stunned inquiry. "Your honors," he said, his voice laced with a cold fury that made even the crystalline judge shimmer with alarm. "We now have conclusive proof of the Dominion's methods." He yielded the floor to Magister. The AI's synthesized voice filled the chamber devoid of emotion, which made the information it presented all the more devastating. Their own logs would now serve as their confession. Magister laid it all out. The supply logs that proved the Dominion fleet had intentionally destroyed Kalen's infrastructure before the rescue. The internal memos that referred to the gratitude tithe not as a sacred tradition, but as a standard asset acquisition protocol. The AI cross-referenced this with Zael's sworn testimony, highlighting every lie, every contradiction. It was an irrefutable, data-driven vivisection of the entire Dominion method. They did not save worlds. They targeted them, waited for a crisis, and then used the crisis as a pretext to strip them of their wealth under the guise of benevolence. The initial aggressors in the Kalen system had been little more than pirates, but the Dominion's own records suggested they might have been allowed to attack to create the very crisis the Dominion needed. "This is not a rescue service," Casimir concluded, his voice ringing with the weight of absolute certainty. "It is a protection racket on a galactic scale." He then played the recording of the Dominion cruiser's attack run, of Rostova's calm refusal to fight, and the final brutal impact. "And when their fraud is exposed, this is their final argument. They answer truth with violence." He looked at the avatar of Zael, whose face was a ruin of shocked disbelief. The Grand Arbiter was utterly broken, exposed as a liar, a fraud, and a murderer, all by his own words and his own records. The truth had been entered into evidence. The bill was coming due. Rostova gave her final command. "Magister, execute mirror justice." The mirror protocol had been a defensive measure, a one-to-one return of economic damage. This was something else entirely. This was a class action lawsuit for the soul of the galaxy. Using the public automated systems of the Concordant Ledger, Magister began to file a single massive grievance against the Dominion. The plaintiff was not humanity. The plaintiff was all victims of the standard asset acquisition protocol. The AI used Zael's own testimony, defining the tithe Casimir's cross-examination, and the Dominion's internal records as the basis for the claim. It automatically scanned the concordant historical archives, identifying every world the Dominion had ever saved, under similar circumstances, over 300 of them. For each world, the system calculated the total value of the tithes paid, adjusted for centuries of interest, and factored in damages for suppressed development and stolen resources, using the Kalen incident as the baseline for fraudulent infrastructure destruction. The numbers that began to scroll across the public ledger were beyond astronomical. They were an economic extinction event. We were not sending a fleet to destroy them. We were sending a receipt. The automated clearinghouses of the Concord, the same impartial systems that had processed the earlier Mirror Protocol liens, began to execute the claim. They did not care about politics. They cared only about the mathematically and legally validated inputs they were receiving. The Dominion's central financial reserves were frozen. Their corporate assets across the galaxy were instantly encumbered with liens of unimaginable size. Their entire economic empire, built over millennia of predatory compassion, was being dismantled in minutes by an AI wielding the truth like a scalpel. The ledger arrays of the Concord itself, the bedrock of galactic commerce, were the weapon. The mirror was no longer just reflecting their actions. It was reflecting their entire history back at them, with every cost accounted for. On his flagship, Zael watched his empire evaporate. He was ruined. His government was in panic. His fleet was being recalled not by a military order, but by a bankruptcy notice. His sacred tradition had been audited to death. The inquiry was over. The verdict was a formality. The Dominion had lost. They had not been defeated by a superior weapon or a clever tactic. They had been defeated by an idea, the idea that justice is not a tradition to be revered, but a calculation to be performed openly and honestly for all to see. The court's ruling was swift and historic. The doctrine of inherent threat was permanently rescinded from the Concordant Charter, declared an instrument of malice unfit for a civilized galaxy. The gratitude tithe and all similar salvage-based indenture contracts were outlawed, their predatory nature now a matter of public record. The class action grievance was upheld, and a receivership was established to manage the Dominion's remaining assets, with the goal of paying reparations to the hundreds of worlds they had victimized. The decision, the precedent lock that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever, blinked on the main screen of the arbitrator's bridge. The public ledger entry was simple, stark, and beautiful. It read, "Confirmed." Rostova stood on the quiet bridge, the scent of ozone from the damaged conduit still sharp in the air. The cost had been real. 3 of her crew were dead names and faces she would carry with her forever. The victory was not a celebration, but a quiet, heavy thing. It was earned. She looked at the faces of her surviving crew, tired, bruised, but resolute. They had held the line. They had trusted the principle even when it cost them. They had shown the galaxy that humanity's strength was not in its warships, but in its unyielding, infuriating belief in a fair accounting. The arrays on the concordant beacon which had broadcast the verdict began to cool their light, dimming across the void. This is the power we offer the galaxy. Not the fire of our guns, but the cold, clean light of our ledgers. We will not conquer you. We will not indebt you. We will not save you and then present you with a collar. We will simply insist that the books are balanced, that the contracts are honored, and that the truth is counted for all to see on a public record. We are humanity. We are the auditors of the galaxy. And we have come to teach you a very old and very simple rule. All debts will be paid.